3, 2, 1. Welcome back to another episode of Digital Voices with WWII. We talk about what's on our hearts, what's on our minds, about interesting topics of today with interesting people. Today's guest is Heige Boehm. Heige is an author, and her writing is influenced by the stories of her parents who grew up in Nazi Germany and who at the end of the war found themselves in East Germany, behind the Iron Curtain. They escaped with their first 2 children to West Berlin in 1961, and Heige was born in West Germany in 1964. 10 years later, her family immigrated to Vancouver, Canada, where they lived at the Sylvia Hotel for the first few months. In 1983, her father was murdered in Texas, and it was Heige's desire to know his stories and to understand him that inspired the novel Secrets in the Shadows. Heige spent 10 years researching and writing Secrets in the Shadows, and she holds a creative writing certificate from the Writers' Studio at Simon Fraser University. She now lives in the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, and it is with profound respect and gratitude that I welcome her to my show. How are you today, Heige, and thank you for coming on Digital Voices.
I'm great, thank you. Thanks for having me, Bo. I'm Heige Boehm, and I'm the author of Secrets in the Shadows.
Your story is kind of interesting. Where are you from originally?
Originally, I'm from Germany. I was born in 1964, and I lived in Cologne for the first 10 years of my life.
Okay.
And we immigrated to Canada in 1974.
That's the year I was born. Now, your story, you were the daughter of 2 German parents that were growing up during World War II.
Correct. My father was born in 1933, the year that Hitler came into power. And my mom was born in 1939 when the war started. And, okay. So yeah, both my parents were children during the war. And, I didn't grow up with, storybooks. My father didn't know how to read or write. Because he grew up during 1933, that's when he was born, his whole being was indoctrinated in the Nazi ideology. Sure. And not until I was much older and actually started writing this book did I start to realize the impact that the war really had on my father. And I did grow up with my mother's war stories. She lived in a town in Schlesien, in Bolau. And at a young age, she had to flee with her stepmom from the advancing Red Army. And so I always grew up hearing her stories, and they were really quite horrific. And again, I knew her stories, but I didn't really listen to it or understand until, again, I started writing this book and I started interviewing my mom actually about her stories. And that gave me a lot of insight into what life must have been like. And along with doing the research, of World War II, again, I understood, wow, what my parents, what their lives was like, and realized that, these were 2 people that were raising a family that really, they had post-traumatic stress. And that explained a lot to me about the complexity of who they were and how they raised us. Living in Germany, I always sort of had war around me, because of mom's stories, and where we lived, there must have been an army base by. At night, army tanks would drive down the road, and I knew what they were. I knew that they brought war, and I'm a little girl, I'm about 4 or 5 years old, and I would watch tanks at night going down the street, And so for me, I always thought war happened at night. And, and I would try to stay awake and try to figure out how to end war because of my mom's war stories, I knew war was bad. And,
how old were you
across
at that
the
age?
street, I was probably about 5. I wasn't much higher than a window sill, you know, and I could just watch them at night rolling down the street, and you hear the lines. Yeah. Those are definitely some of my early memories, watching army tanks, and that's quite a lot for a kid to see, you know. And I would combine that with my mom's war stories. My dad never said anything about what his encounters were during the war, so I just knew mom's. And across the street from us was a war bunker, and as kids we would try to go. I remember going down the stairs, and there was a big gate, and the neighbors had said, "Don't go in there." A boy had gotten into that war bunker and died. And so for me, again, as a young kid, I thought, well, why aren't you getting him out? Why are you leaving him in there? I didn't really understand, you know, death. And so that really always bothered me. And so there were those sorts of moments that really seared into my mind, you know, and made me think war happened at night. And half of my family lived in East Germany, and we would go and visit them. And on our way there, through the train station, on the platforms, you would see soldiers standing with, you know, rifles. And again, it was just like connected to my mom's war stories that, you know, soldiers carry weapons, and that must mean there's a war. And in East Germany, not a lot of reconstruction happened during the war, where what I had seen. And so I would see, you know, bullet holes in buildings. East Germany at that time was really, really gray. My step grandma was quite, you know, she lived in a 3-story walk up, and they still had outhouses out back. And that's where my mom grew up. And so again, it reiterated and connected me back to my mom's stories. So for me, war always was something that was still around. I could feel it and see it, the remnants of it, you know, and combined with the army tanks that I would see at night, war continually was going on. And it wasn't really until we moved here to Canada and I went to school did I start to feel and understand more about the war, because it was from a different perspective that was presented to me. I only really had it from my mom's perspective with the Russians. And so when I came here,
let's talk about that perspective, just so that we can understand. How was it different, and what was the perspective over there at that time?
Like in Germany?
Yeah. So if you were raised in Germany, what was the perspective on World War II and Hitler and Nazism?
Well, right. So I can only come from, you know, from a child's point of view of what I knew. And like I said, what I knew about the war was from my mom's perspective, from her war stories, that, you know, they had to flee from the advancing Russians late in the war. And I didn't really understand, you know, Nazi and Hitler and the amount of racism that was connected to that. You know, my older sisters, they were starting to learn about the Holocaust in school, but I wasn't, you know, because I was like in grade 3 when we came to Canada. And so I knew a teeny bit, but it didn't make sense to me. You know, we had a hiding place in our basement, and my oldest sister, they had said, "Oh, this is where Jews live," and they hid under our stairs. And so in a little kid's mind, I'm like, why are Jews living under my stairs? and why can't they come and live with us upstairs? I didn't really understand what she was saying because I'm a kid, quite young. And I never, growing up until I sort of left and sort of came here later on, I thought, gee, how was I taught in school? Because like my school principal, he must have fought in the war. The grocery checkout lady, she must have gone through the war, older people, but nobody really ever said anything. They didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about it. The only stories I heard were from my mom. My mom always told us her story, but never really listened until I started writing this book. Did I really listen and understand the impact of what that was? Germany at the time was really, really white, and we had, the Americans were there, and so you would hear stories about, there's the Amis, the Americans, because they had army bases there, but it wasn't part of my, growing up. I just had those small vignettes into war, and to me that was war,
Sure. Well,
but I didn't really understand it.
Now, you were locked behind the Iron Curtain, obviously in East Germany, which there's a difference between East Germany and West Germany for our younger listeners. Could you describe what that was like? Right.
So my mom and dad, after the war, they lived in East Germany. And my two older sisters were born in East Germany. I was born in West Germany. My mom and dad, they actually escaped in 1961, literally the night before the wall started being built.
Okay.
And we would go visit, but when mom had to leave because dad, he had beaten a Russian diplomat because he didn't pay his bill at a restaurant. And so the owner of that place told dad, you better leave or else you're going to go to jail for this. And so that night, mom and dad actually left. They had to leave everything behind, and mom just was able to take a change of clothing for her oldest daughter, who was not even 2, and her second child, my second sister, she was actually in the hospital, and so they had to go and take her out of that hospital. And at night, they hid in a garden shed house, and then the next morning, a cab driver took them to Berlin, and they stayed on the train. And the guards would try to, when they saw families like that they were trying to escape, they would separate the husband and the wives from the kids. And dad had bought a set of flowers, and when they were stopped by the guards, dad had said, oh no, we're visiting our grandma to show the kids. And East Germany was sort of a loop. You had to go through the West in order to go back to the East. And so they just stayed on the train. And when they came to the West, they got off and at the Marina Belt, and they stayed in a refugee camp there for 6 months. East Germany being under Russian occupation, you had to line up for food. You didn't have all the amenities that you had here. I mean, some of my cousins, they still worked in loom factories done by hand. The infrastructure wasn't really modern, in a sense. Once the wall came down, it was like this time capsule in a sense. They would have one kind of toothpaste, one kind of soap. Life was really, really hard. Anything that we would send to them, at the borders would get checked to make sure that they weren't getting, certain information of the West, or you had the Stasi. Later on I learned that my father's brother was a Stasi, and those were people, that the secret police that would report on their own, hope with, I don't know, with hope of maybe getting extra rations or a little bit more money. Communism. And that was really interesting. As a kid, when we could go and visit, but they couldn't come and visit us, not until the people were 65, and then they didn't care whether they went to other areas in Germany. They were allowed out. So in fact, they were like in prison in East Germany.
How long was East Germany walled off from everyone else? How long were they isolated?
The wall came down in 1990.
And I remember that I graduated in 92. So when that was almost like 31 years, I think is what we're looking at, right?
Yeah.
It's a long time to be isolated from friends and family. I just wanted to put that as a point, because how that affected the people that had to stay there, or those that were able to escape but then not be able to go home. That's a whole generational time. I can only imagine what that was like for you folks.
Yeah, like Mom, she couldn't tell anyone of her family members. She couldn't tell her brothers or her stepsisters that she was fleeing. They had to do it overnight, because if anybody knew that they were leaving, they would get interrogated by it. And so nobody knew. And Mom couldn't go back for 5 years. And in fact, Dad had said to my mom, leave one of my sisters who was in the hospital, leave her and give her to your mom to raise. And Mom said, no, they'll put her in a home and she'll get raised by the state. And so they actually had to go and sneak her out of the hospital that night. So it really did, tear families terribly apart, because also some of the people, they believed in communism because it was a way of life for them, and they made living career out of supporting the communist regime. And there was also Germans who obviously didn't want that. They wanted their freedom. And so you had that within the family as well. And so it really tore families apart with the point of view,
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of American Civil War, where there was this internal conflict, and it was the ideologies that were, internal ideologies of a company or of a country that, you have a steep divide where, you're fighting brother against brother on the field, but then you go home and you're all living together. It sounds like some of that was occurring over there as well.
Oh, definitely. Like one of my mom's brothers, he worked at recruiting people to the Communist Party and joining it. And because Mom had escaped, he almost lost his job and never really got much further promoted, because Mom had escaped. And a lot of her family members at the time then were interrogated by it.
So whether or not they knew anything
by
or not,
they
were going to be interrogated either way, kind of. It's a tough situation. Yeah. So you were able to escape, and you were able to get out of the country. And when you were about 9, you immigrated to Canada. What was that like, and how did you get out of Europe?
Well, we were in the West, so we were allowed to travel anywhere. And I think in 1974, they were still, the immigration, they wanted people to come to North America. And, I guess Dad, having been under, the Nazi regime for a large part of his early childhood, he wanted a type of freedom and thought here this was a better place for us. And so they packed up the house and we moved to Canada and came straight to Vancouver. And, I remember, I don't remember much about, I don't really remember being in the airplane or anything like that, but I thought everything would be exactly the same. I didn't really understand language difference, even though my older sisters were already learning English in school. And so they were trying to teach us younger kids. And I knew one word, everybody. But instead of everybody, I thought it was everybody. And, and so that was the only word I knew. When I came here, I loved it. I thought, it was so different. I felt a kind of freedom because I didn't see what I saw in Germany. It was, I guess it's just a sense of freedom. Everything was so different. The houses were different. People were different. I never saw so many different nationalities. And, I found it really quite exciting as a kid. But, my first day of school, I was in school with my sisters. We were all in the same elementary school, and we were called Nazi, Hitler, Jew killer. And I didn't understand what I had done. And that sort of started this whole thing of me feeling guilty and responsible for the atrocities of World War II. And that sort of started, eroding your self-esteem as well.
Did that happen with your family, like other members of your family as well? Because I can only imagine how that would have made me feel.
So I have 5 siblings, so there's 6 of us, and 5 of us were all at the same elementary school, and we were, during recess or lunch, we would be together, and so kids would shout those comments at us, and my younger sister, she forgot quite a bit about that, and we had conversations and we brought it up, and she was just realized, wow, I thought I had dealt with this. I totally forgot about it. And then she got quite upset about it.
Kids can be really...
You don't really... Sorry?
I said kids can be the cruelest. They can be very cruel.
Yeah. But also, I don't know what their stories were, what their family history was, Sure. And it was one of the first times, too, that they encountered somebody from a foreign country. I think we were the only kids at school that were from another country at the time, and didn't speak the language. So, I don't know what their backgrounds and their history and their connection to World War II was.
Sounds like the pain of the war, though, just globally, there was this resonating feeling felt that was hard for everyone to deal with, no matter where you came from. And everybody had a different perspective on it, which was...
Yeah, it does. It's this generational effect, definitely, that war has. And, I thought about, last night I was talking to my mom, and I'm still recording her. And, I said to her, I said, gee, Mom, your mom and your dad would have fought and been part of World War I. And she never really thought about that. And she goes, yeah. And I said, so they were already traumatized and understood what war does. And then they went through a second war. And so did my mom, and the impact that had on her, and how both my mom and dad raised us with they both had trauma and post-traumatic stress, and how do you raise? And so, yeah, it definitely had an impact on myself and my siblings on how we were raised, whether it was with my dad being very strict and violent outbursts, and what that did to us. And, I look at my nieces and nephews, and I think, what impact does that have on them? Because we were impacted by our parents, and how are they raising their kids with that? And it's a generational thing. And I don't know where I read it, but it said, it takes like 8 generations to get rid of traumas that happen to an individual, which
is a long time.
Really, it's a really long time. And you think about all the things that are going on in the world, and you're just going, wow, if there's 8 generations that it takes, shouldn't we make our policies and our procedures and our decisions with that in mind of 8 generations after us? How what we decide now, how will that impact them? Because it does impact,
No, I agree with that. And our focus is always on now. One of the reasons why the world's in such a state, if you will, of chaos. We have all these issues that we have to deal with, but the actions of our forefathers resonate throughout time, whether it's 8 generations or it's just amazing.
Definitely, and I think. I think too, like, to keep that in mind, it's sort of like who we elect, who we vote into power. We just saw what happens when you allow certain ideologies, falsehoods, and people going with that. That's what Hitler and his ideology. Look what that brought. The destruction of democracy. And I just think, what would have happened if people stepped up sooner and didn't allow what happened, protested more, held the officials accountable.
I agree with that. There's that peer pressure, though, isn't that a large part of why that doesn't happen? Is socially. There might be laws in place that are enforcing this, but socially, this indoctrination has been, completely brought in and internalized. Like you were talking about, one of the relatives that was also secret police. It's difficult. It's difficult when you have that kind of a situation to stand up.
Yeah, I think exactly like my dad's brother being in a belief system and trying to get everybody else into a type of mindset ideology. Why did he do that? What part of that? Was it out of fear? Was it in order to gain a higher position in life? Was he trying to climb the political ladder? He was benefiting out of that. And can we just put that on, well, I didn't really know where this would lead. And I think so often, our political leaders, they align themselves and they push a false narrative that works for them, and they'll stay by that, and that's dangerous when people in power use fear tactics.
I agree.
And racism, sexism, target minorities, and try to get rid of laws that help push their agenda. And all I could think of is, you have to hold official people in power accountable to that. And World War II really, it's such a playbook on, when you look at what Hitler, Goebbels, what they did, they wrote the playbook on how to destroy a dictatorship. And it's, it hangs. It's so precarious, and it's so important to understand what our freedom really means and to protect that. And for me, I saw what a dictatorship does. I saw what it did to my mom and dad. I know what it's done to me. And when you see these things playing out throughout the world, it's really, it's scary, but you have to stand up and you have to have a voice and help push the pendulum in the world to a kinder place, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm making any
No, you're
sense.
absolutely right. You're getting at some things that that I think are important in discussion. Outside of just your book, although your book relates real well to it. We are living in a time of globalization, and we're living in a time of changing.
It reminds me when I was doing the research, Ed Krawinkle, who was a paratrooper and a boy soldier, and he was a paratrooper with the SS and a sniper. And, that was the first time that I was doing such an interview. And I was really nervous. And I kept saying to myself, just don't judge, try to understand, ask questions and listen. Mm-hmm. What can you learn? Mm-hmm. Don't go into it with being guarded and fear. Just listen to what this person has to say so that you can get into that mindset. Mm-hmm. And it made me sort of think, try to understand somebody, have dialogue and conversations, stay open and try to learn from somebody and take the good from other cultures. Mm-hmm. And really sort of try to understand them instead of approaching it with fear, falsehood, stereotyping. We all bleed, and we can learn from each other and take the best from ourselves. Mm-hmm. And offer that to learn to really work together. By really listening to my mom, I understood and I was able to forgive things that happened in my childhood that my parents put onto me, whether it was a certain type of abuse or, physical, mental. I was able to forgive because I was able to understand their circumstances. Mm-hmm. And how that shaped that person. Mm-hmm. Aside from my mom being my mom and dad, they were children. And these were the things that happened to them. And, I learned from that. I grew from that. And hopefully, they passed the baton further to me. And I think that's with anyone, in my day job, I'm a hairdresser and I stand behind the chair and I listen to people all day long and have conversations, meaningful conversations. And I learn about their lives. And I've done that for over 30 years. And coming from that, what I took back is, we're all the same. We all want love. We all want to be heard and cared for. Mm-hmm. And we really aren't that different. We're a lot more similar and our circumstances are different and how we respond to our environment can be very different.
Exactly.
But at the end,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the end, we want to be loved and heard and give love back.
The basic needs and the basic emotions are the same amongst all of us. Skin color doesn't matter at all. One of the things mm-hmm. I do find, though, is this interesting, there's an ethnocentric belief, depending on where you're from, where you're superior to everyone else. And I live in a country that's a prime example of that. One of mm-hmm. the constant slogans that you hear is America, and it's supposed to instill this feeling of pride. However, we forget what we're making or what we're prideful of is our diversity and our racial diversity and the things that come along with sharing all of those great cultural high points from every different society, whether it's food, culture, belief, and there's so many similarities. So one of the things that I see in my country, in America, is this we have an idea that we're better than everybody else, but we don't know why, and then we try to make everybody else believe it too. And we just need to open up our minds and be a little bit more sensitive to our neighbors, and we'll realize that there's so many great things about so many different people in so many different places.
Definitely. And I think that whole belief of I'm proud of my country, you have to sort of look at it and go, okay, well, what are you proud of?
Mm-hmm.
What have you given to your place of origin? And you have to look at the atrocities that your country has done, and have you addressed those atrocities?
Mm-hmm.
Have you tried to resolve them? What were the lingering effects of those atrocities?
Right.
How are they still being perpetuated? In thought, ideology, education, and what are you doing about it? And I think for me, when people say, I'm proud to be Canadian, I'm proud to be German, I'm proud to be American, I'm proud whatever.
Mm-hmm.
What does that really mean? Because there's lots of things I'm not proud of that Canada has done, or I look at America and I think what they have done, or other countries,
Mm-hmm.
because I wasn't part of that. I wasn't, I came here in 74, but what have I done to again, I push the pendulum to a kinder world?
Mm-hmm.
What am I leaving behind that instead of filling myself up with this ego, I'm great because,
Mm-hmm.
It's a falsehood. When you constantly have to, I feel, say to yourself, that mantra, I'm great, and make yourself believe that. Right then and there in my head, I think if I have to make myself believe it, obviously there's something false here. There's something not right. Because if I have to make myself believe it, it tells me something is not correct.
Right.
Because if it is, it just is. It's the knowing. And I don't have to let everybody else know. That's a small mind, I have to let everybody else know how great I am. Why do you have to do that?
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. This kind of leads into the substance of your book. Am I right? A little bit. Questioning these ideas that we're growing up with, and how that the idea of thought behind where you're from changes over time as you get older. And you start to realize, or you start to experience some realities that put what you thought you knew in check. And that's a little bit of what your book's about, isn't
it? A big part of it, because Michael, the protagonist, he idolizes his dad, and his dad, is a strong Nazi supporter and is an SS. And Michael wants to be just like that, and he wants to just support Hitler. He believes the ideology. It's exciting. He's a young kid. This is exciting. And slowly, as he matures and through certain circumstances, he all of a sudden starts to question that, which starts to question himself as well. But what do? Like you're following along pack mentality, I suppose, and you have this bunch of people saying, yeah, this is right, and the victor can do no wrong, and he realizes, wait a minute, this isn't right. But it's too late. He's on the battlefield. What do you do now? All of a sudden he's realizing this for sure. And one of the things is I thought would be interesting is to, within the same family, have difference of opinion. You know, Rudy, the father, is really strong supporter of the Nazis. He believes it, and the mother doesn't, and she doesn't get to have a voice, but she still has to raise these kids. Mm-hmm. And how do you raise your children with an open heart when one of the parents is, you know, an SS,
mm-hmm.
Nazi white supremacist? How do you do that? So that was a really, for me, a great way to explore, again, my mom and my dad's situation with
mm-hmm.
some members believing one thing and others not believing that, you know. And so it was great to try and put that in, and it helped me to try to understand mom and dad as well. It's like unraveling the psychology behind it
mm-hmm.
was a big part of putting that in the novel. You know, you have people for it, against it, not understanding, not caring, you know, putting themselves in harm's way for somebody else,
mm-hmm.
and looking at it from a different perspective. You know, growing up for me, I saw what I saw on TV was the Germans were always the villains, which in turn for me was like, oh, I must be bad too. And then, you know, as I got older, again, to understand, but I'm not. How do I want to understand them? And
mm-hmm.
that goes back to, we need to understand our neighbors. How do they, what's going on for them? Who are they? What's their story?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and once we know a person's story, we tend to have compassion for them.
And you find
that's one of the things I wanted
too,
to
right?
do.
Don't you?
Exactly. We're not all that different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the big part.
Definitely. And that's what I kind of wanted to do was, you know, really push that, you know, of what we think. And also, you know, in the story, there was a part, where Michael shoots a Canadian. And I remember a friend of mine, she read this part and she was like, I'm so glad they killed that guy because he, you know, was going to kill Michael and Wolfie. So they were happy that boys didn't die. And in my mind, I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? The reason you feel happy is because you don't know that guy's story. If I told you the backstory,
mm-hmm.
you would actually think, I'm so sad that person died.
Right.
And again, that goes back into, you know, seeing so many customers in my hairdressing career. And again, asking what people's stories are. And all of a sudden, you know, from what I thought, who these people were, for listening to their stories, I gain understanding and knowledge. And through that, I understand myself better, you know,
mm-hmm.
Not to be so quick to judge and think in stereotype ways.
This must have been really healing for you and your family. Was it during the process that you started? Because you said something that resonated with me. For you, understanding gave you the tools to forgive. So you're kind of breaking
mm-hmm.
down a lot of the different viewpoints within your family, within the culture, and then you're sowing it in a way with this seed in the book that allows the reader to hopefully change their point of view, or at least see it from a different paradigm. Taking all of this, you've woven it together, you are now sharing your story in a way that then opens up other people's eyes, and hopefully, again, this trickle effect, you know. First of all, was it healing for you?
No, all of it. You know, when I started, I wanted to, my father was murdered in 1983 in Texas. And losing a parent at, you know, I was in my teens and I was extremely close to my father. And so I wanted to know him. I wanted to know his story. And obviously, you know, that's why I started writing the book, to make that, to try and understand him. So I made Michael, the character, just a little bit older than my father, so I could understand him. And by writing and researching, I started to understand his situation, what that might have been like. And by interviewing my mom, I definitely learned to understand and have compassion for her. But what happened through me interviewing her and having discussions, she would tell me her stories. They were almost very robotic. And I started to ask her questions of, well, how did you feel? What was that like? What did you actually see? And I realized in that, you know, she had felt shame and responsibility for World War II. And not until I sort of said to her, I said, you know, Mom, you were a child and you, in fact, were not responsible for any of this. Your government of that time is responsible for this. And the people who followed the orders and perpetrated crimes are responsible for that. And those are the people that have to be held accountable, not you. Mm-hmm. You didn't do anything. And that was the first time that she heard that. So yeah, that was really healing for her. And because of that, we can have harder conversations. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for me as well, you know, it let me be able to let go of the shame and guilt that I felt mm-hmm. as well. And realizing, wait a minute, this is not me. I'm in fact impacted, like, you know, earlier we were talking about. And so by understanding and learning about the history, it definitely freed me and opened me up to be able to have conversations without feeling guarded or responsible. Acknowledging the atrocities that the country of my origin, that government of the time committed, by really acknowledging it and seeing it and looking at it, it frees me, you know, and I think a lot of times as people, we look at, you know, the atrocities around us, and we carry that guilt and that shame where it really belongs to the people that are implementing those policies and procedures and acting on those policies and procedures that are harmful for other people.
Right.
And I think when we don't look at those things, it's hard to heal from it. And we need to acknowledge, I think, the atrocities that are happening around us and did happen generations ago, so that we can move on and heal from that. That, you know, acknowledge it, yeah, and also acknowledge how we're feeling about it as well. You know, how we're behaving because of those feelings as well. So for me, yes, definitely. For my family, it made them understand my parents better. They're, you know, and able to forgive mom and dad for some of the things that happened in our childhood. Mm-hmm. And it gained a deeper level of compassion. So yeah.
Your journey has been...
It changed me.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Mm-hmm. The way that you dealt with it, I don't think that there's any better way to deal with that than researching, understanding, writing about it, sharing. There's a lot of symbols that come in your first novel, but you're currently working on your second, correct?
This and it's about a secondary.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's about a secondary character, and Paula, Michael's sister. And she goes off to Ukraine as a nurse. And when I was doing research for my book, Figures in the Shadows, I came upon a book called Hitler's Furies by Wendy Lau, I think it is. And let me just get that book. Sorry. Yeah. Hitler's Furies by Wendy Lauer. And in that, she talked about the killing fields in Ukraine and the responsibility of secondary workers. And it's just sort of, when I was reading that, I thought, wow, we don't look at the secondary workers, mm-hmm. you know, as in the support workers, the secretaries. And I just thought, what would that be like as a young woman? And all of a sudden being in the middle of the killing field. Mm-hmm. So I started writing from, you know, character women and young women and what happened to them.
Sure.
And that actually I find really hard. I found it really easy writing from a male perspective, and I'm finding it really hard writing from a female perspective.
How so?
I think because, growing up, my heroes weren't women. In the 70s, my mom wasn't allowed to have a job. She wasn't allowed to have friends. It was the males that held all the control of the money. She was given money for buying groceries. She had to ask for everything. Women weren't allowed to have credit cards. That whole stereotyping of women become teachers or nurses was still really palatable then. And so I didn't like that. And I saw my mom struggling raising 6 children. I just thought, wow, this doesn't look good. But my dad had all the freedom, and all my heroes on TV were, Tarzan, Robin Hood, Captain Kirk, Pippi Longstocking, people that just had control and power. And so they were pretty much all men. And I followed what my dad did. He had all the control and power. And I think that sort of indoctrinated me on thinking much more of the superheroes that I like. They happened to be all men, not women. I didn't identify. I couldn't relate to the women, pushing strollers and children. It just looked really cumbersome to me and didn't look fun. And it didn't look like they had adventures. And my nature was to have fun and have adventures. And so I think that's a big part of it. But I'm struggling through it, and I'm getting that.
I think the best compliment to be called is a teacher, and you're teaching us, and the hardships that you and your family had to go through, at the very least, are lessons that you're teaching future generations through your work, and giving us a broader perspective.
Wow, that's so kind. Thank you. That's really kind of you to say that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for what you do.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a better compliment to give.
They are using this. It's like it's really. I'm really quite humbled. Right now, I'm blushing. I think. I started at 16 working behind the chair as a hairdresser, and I always say that my customers raised me. And when you think about how many people I've had go through my hands and listen to their stories, I gained a wider understanding of people, the humanness of us all, and it made me understand myself better and accept what's around me, who I am, and understand it and forgive, and we live one life, and what do we want to leave behind? And like I say to a lot of people, again, let's try to push that pendulum to a kinder world. And I can't change the whole world in my lifetime, but I can help push that pendulum, and I think we can all help push that pendulum to a kinder world with our intentions,
Amen to that. I agree with that 100%. Do you have a title for the new novel yet that I can plug anyways? If not...
Well, right now, a lot of times the titles of books, they do get changed, so I'm never hung up on what the book is called. In fact, like Secrets in the Shadows, at the 11th hour, I came up with that title, and I was just like, I don't really care, just call it anything.
Sure.
And so my working title for this novel, the second novel, is called Black Earth. The Ukraine at the time was the breadbasket of Europe, and the earth was so black. And so I just thought I'll call it Black Earth for now, for different, reasons.
Yeah. I like the title.
Because they were the...
Yeah.
Thank you.
It sounds great. I think it fits in with the last one. When you might, do you have an idea when you might be finished with that one?
I'm about halfway through, and I hope to get the first draft done in the next 2 months, and then I have to work at editing it, and that'll probably take me through the end of the summer, and then I submit it to my publisher, and hopefully he'll want to publish this one. And so maybe in the spring or summer of 2023.
Okay, perfect.
Somewhere around there. It'll probably about another year.
Okay.
I would think.
Well, I'm
trying as best as I can.
I'm going to put links for your current novel, Secrets in the Shadows, in the description for the podcast. Also, I will be putting in your other links. There's 1 or 2 for YouTube, and then some of the videos that you've done. I think those are really interesting as well. Anything that you want to share with us before I let you
go? I just, follow your moral compasses and love yourself and ask questions and get to know people that you don't know. Get to know who's around you. Be kind to other people and ask questions. Learn about other countries and cultures, and help push that pendulum to a kinder world.
It's the story of us, right? Not the story of me, not the story of you. It's the story of us.
Exactly.
I like that.
Well, we get to learn about ourselves in the reflection of others' eyes.
I like that a lot too.
Yeah.
There's no truer barometer than a third person looking in. Oftentimes, who we think we are isn't who we want to be, even though we're trying to be a certain way. My time with you has been enjoyable. It's been insightful. The stories and the wisdom that you shared have been amazing.
Thank you.
If you would be so kind, I'd like to reach out in a year or two when you're done with your next book, and maybe we could have another conversation and share some ideas.
I would totally love that.
That would be great with me too.
Totally would love that. Wonderful. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast, because that's a great way of reaching out, especially during COVID, And,
absolutely.
I'm fairly, it's wonderful. So I do appreciate it. Thank you for reaching out and having me on your show. And you're absolutely wonderful and great conversation with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I wish you best of days, and we'll talk again. And until then, keep spreading that positive energy, because together we'll change the world, I promise.
Yes. All right. That sounds really good.
All right. You have yourself a great day.
Thank you, Bo.
You bet. Bye now.
You too.